She told me to stop acting like we're married, said I don't get to tell her where she goes or who she's with. So I didn't argue. I just let her find out what not married really means when her key stopped working. I knew I had crossed a line the night she told me to stop acting like we were married. We were in her apartment, a small loft with brick walls exposed like they were trying to tell some kind of story, the kind of place that felt lived in, even though she'd only been there a year. The sun was dipping behind the skyline, painting everything in gold and pink streaks that made the hardwood floor glow. She stood by the kitchen counter, arms folded, looking at me with this sharp clarity that made my chest tighten. Support our channel, like, share, and subscribe. Your clicks help us bring you even better videos. You don't get to tell me where I go or who I see, she said, and her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, like she'd delivered this line in her head dozens of times. Her eyes didn't flinch, they didn't soften, and I realized in that moment that I had been pretending that her rules weren't her rules, that our dynamic was something we both agreed upon silently, when really she had drawn the line in the sand weeks ago, and I just ignored it. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I had felt the words coming out of her mouth like an avalanche that left me rooted to the spot. I nodded instead, a small acknowledgement, hoping it would be enough. But inside, something churned, a slow, cold awareness that not married wasn't just a label. It was an invitation, or maybe a warning. That evening, after she left for her yoga class, I lingered in the living room, tracing my fingers along the spine of books she had lined up haphazardly on the shelves. Some of them I recognized, the ones she had mentioned in passing, the kind that revealed her taste, dark, precise, introspective. The apartment smelled faintly of sandalwood and coffee, a combination that somehow reminded me of safety and danger at the same time. I sipped my whiskey slowly, watching the shadows stretch across the floor, and thought about what she had said. I thought about control, about boundaries, about the way she held herself in the world with this confidence that made me both admire her and want to challenge her. It wasn't that I wanted to control her. It was that I wanted her to know I cared enough to care, that I wanted her to see me as someone who mattered in ways she hadn't allowed yet. Days passed. I kept my distance, followed her rules. I told myself it was about respect, about letting her breathe, but each time she left, each time she returned, I felt the tension coil tighter inside me, like a spring waiting for the right moment to release. And then came the night the key didn't work. It started like any other evening. She had gone out to dinner with friends, leaving the apartment quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I had decided to tidy up a bit, move her books, straighten the cushions, adjust the rug just so. It wasn't malicious. It was a ritual. A way to feel connected to her when she was away. The key in my hand was hers, the one she never let me use. I had never turned it in the lock before. I didn't plan anything, didn't think of traps or games. I simply wanted to see, to understand, to test the invisible rules she had set. The first turn of the key met resistance, stiff and stubborn. I frowned, my heart picking up speed. I tried again, more deliberately, and then I realized the lock had changed. The key wouldn't turn at all. I stepped back, bewildered, feeling a strange mix of triumph and uncertainty. It was a simple thing, a key, but it carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. The lock had become a barrier, a symbol, a silent message that the dynamic between us was shifting. And then I understood. She had told me indirectly that boundaries exist, but boundaries, I realized, are never fully respected until they are challenged. When she returned that night, the air between us was charged. I didn't say anything about the key. I watched her fumble, the faint confusion in her eyes as she tried to enter, the soft muttering under her breath as she jiggled the lock, and in that moment I saw the subtle shift, her control slipping, her certainty rattled, even if only slightly. Her frustration grew. She tried the key again and again, her hands trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it with irritation. I leaned against the doorway, silent, watching. She looked up finally, caught my eye, and in that moment her mask faltered. There was a flash of something, vulnerability, shock, disbelief. I don't understand, she said, voice sharp but breaking at the edges. You'll figure it out, I said softly, letting the words hang in the air. And then she did. The days that followed were a study in tension. She adjusted, recalibrated, and the apartment became a theater of subtle power plays, small tests, silent negotiations. Every glance, every movement carried meaning. I watched her learn what not married really meant, and in turn I began to see her differently. She wasn't just the woman who issued rules and expected obedience. She was fragile, capable of being caught off guard, and yet stubbornly resolute. She was human. The city outside our windows carried on, indifferent, a backdrop of neon lights and traffic hums, as if nothing had changed. But inside, the world was contained in the apartment, in the lock, in the space between us that grew both tighter and more electric. And I realized that what began as a boundary, a line drawn in sand, had transformed into a landscape of negotiation, curiosity, and quiet, dangerous fascination. One evening, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone, silent, almost withdrawn. The key sat on the nightstand, untouched, gleaming under the soft light of the lamp. I sat beside her, close enough to feel the heat of her body, but not touching. We didn't speak for a long time, letting the silence fill the room like a living entity. Finally, she looked at me, and her eyes were softer, less certain, more questioning. "Why did you do it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted you to see what it feels like," I said, meeting her gaze, letting her take in the weight of my words, to know that boundaries are not just rules, they're choices, and choices have consequences. Her breath hitched slightly, and I knew she understood, not in anger, not in frustration, but in a quiet, unsettling clarity that left us both exposed. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning, a fracture in the rhythm we had established, a crack that allowed for something deeper, something unpredictable, to seep through. And as I left that night, walking past the streetlights that painted long shadows across the sidewalk, I felt a strange exhilaration, the kind that comes from dancing on the edge of chaos without falling. Yet I didn't see her the next morning. Not that it was unusual. She had her own rhythm, her own orbit, but there was a hollow note in the apartment that made me pause. The faint smell of last night's incense lingered, a ghost of warmth and routine. I moved around the kitchen slowly, methodical, almost meditative. Dishes from dinner she had prepared the night before were stacked neatly, as if untouched since she left. The sunlight crept through the blinds, slicing lines across the countertop, illuminating dust particles that floated lazily in the air. I felt the quiet keenly, like a presence I couldn't name. I decided to leave a note, something small, casual, not accusing, just a marker of my presence. A line written on a scrap of paper. "Coffee's on. Don't let the apartment win today." I placed it on the counter where I knew she would see it. It felt like a game of chess, subtle moves, gentle provocations, testing patience, testing boundaries, testing reactions. By the time she returned, the sky had already begun to bruise with early evening colors. Violet and muted orange streaked across the horizon. She opened the door, paused, and I saw the weight of hesitation in her shoulders, the slow tilt of her head, as if measuring whether she was walking into a trap or something more uncertain. Her hair was tucked behind one ear, slightly messy from whatever errands she had run, and there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there when the key stopped working. "Coffee?" I asked, nodding toward the counter, keeping my tone neutral, casual. She glanced at the note, then back at me, and for a heartbeat she didn't respond. And then, softly, "I see what you're doing," she said. I shrugged, a small, innocent motion, but I felt the tension ripple through the room. "Maybe, or maybe I just wanted coffee." She laughed, the sound low and uneven, not quite the full laughter I was used to, but a version stretched thin over restraint and surprise. She walked past me to the kitchen, moved around with a kind of deliberate slowness, and poured herself a cup. The faint clink of the mug against the counter echoed in the apartment, marking presence, marking territory, marking acknowledgement that she was still in control. Or at least, she believed she was. I watched her, careful not to stare too long. Something had shifted. The key incident had started a cascade of subtle changes, small cracks forming in routines I had assumed were static. She was more alert, more aware of how I existed in the space. Every glance I caught, every pause in her movements, felt loaded with unspoken communication. Later that night, we ended up in the living room. She sat cross-legged on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling through something I didn't ask about, didn't want to know. I moved to the armchair opposite her, the lamp casting a halo of soft yellow light over us, creating a chiaroscuro that made the shadows dance across her face. I could see the tension in her jaw, the faint tightening of her hands around the phone. "You didn't change the locks," she said suddenly, her voice measured, but with an edge I could sense even if it was carefully contained. "No reason to," I replied softly. "You might notice if I did." Her gaze flicked up at me, sharp, assessing. "And if I did?" "Then we'd talk about it," I said. Like we're not married." She paused, mouth slightly open, eyes narrowing as if weighing my words for hidden meanings, for traps, for the subtle manipulations I might be attempting. There was a beat where time seemed to stretch. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, the faint creak of the apartment settling, all of it became a kind of soundtrack to the tension building between us. She set her phone down slowly, deliberately, and leaned back. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, almost a whisper. "I'm just curious," I replied. "Curious how it feels when the rules aren't clear." Her laugh was quiet, bittersweet, and I noticed her shoulders relax slightly, as if admitting, even to herself, that she was intrigued, even unsettled by my calm audacity. The next few days turned into a pattern, small acts of challenge, small moments of testing, interspersed with intimacy and ordinary life. It was like we were building a new language, one spoken in glances, gestures, silences. I would leave her subtle messages, adjust the placement of furniture, sometimes occupy spaces she expected to have to herself. Each act was minor, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight because it interrupted the rhythm she had carefully constructed. One evening, she came home later than usual, the rain falling in thin sheets outside, tapping the windows with a rhythm that matched the quiet storm inside my chest. She shook off her coat, water dripping onto the mat, and I noticed a small tremor in her hands. She didn't say anything at first, just stood in the middle of the room, staring at the wall as if she had forgotten she was home. "You're tired," I said, breaking the silence. "I'm thinking," she said, voice low, almost lost to the patter of rain. "Thinking about boundaries, about control, about trust." I felt a flicker of triumph, careful to mask it, careful to keep the tone soft. Boundaries are just rules. Rules can be flexible, or they can teach you what freedom feels like when it's withheld. Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw the mixture I had been chasing, the curiosity, the caution, the faint flicker of frustration. There was a softness there, but it was edged with suspicion. She crossed the room slowly, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The droplets from her coat fell silently onto the floor. "You're relentless," she said. "I don't know if I should be annoyed or impressed." "Both," I said simply. That night, as she slept, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain hit the windows. I thought about how quickly dynamics could shift, how easily control could slip, and how fragile the illusion of certainty was. I realized then that what had started as a small experiment, a key that wouldn't turn, had grown into something much more dangerous, something intoxicating. We weren't just negotiating the rules of our relationship, we were negotiating power, presence, trust, and fear. The next week brought its own surprises. She started leaving little notes for me, post-its with brief, clipped messages. "Don't move the rug," "Coffee in the morning," "Watch the third drawer in the kitchen." It was playful. It was testing. It was a silent acknowledgement that she had noticed the rhythm I was imposing on the apartment, on the space, on her life. I found myself smiling at these notes, reading into them more than I should have, interpreting them as dialogue rather than commands. Each note was a chess move, and I was beginning to understand the game she was trying to play. She was learning, adapting, responding, but she was also revealing something I hadn't anticipated, that she craved control, even as she was being nudged out of it. One night, I decided to push it further. I moved the third drawer she had mentioned, slightly, just enough to create a subtle difference. I left it ajar, a small invitation, and waited. She came home later, late enough that the streets were dark, the city lights blurred by drizzle. She paused at the kitchen, caught sight of the drawer, and froze. Her fingers hovered over it, and I watched her internal calculation unfold in micro-expressions, the narrowing of her eyes, the twitch of her mouth, the subtle tilt of her head. And then she laughed, quietly, almost under her breath, a sound I had never heard before. "You're impossible," she said softly. Every day you find a way to make me question everything. I just make sure you're awake, I said, shrugging. She shook her head, smiling faintly, and for a moment I felt a fragile peace, the kind that comes when both players in a game understand the rules, even if they're still shifting. But then the shadows lengthened. The next morning I woke to find her gone. The apartment silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. A note sat on the counter, different from the others. Meet me tonight. At the park, 9 p.m. I felt a ripple of anticipation. The park wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk, but it was deliberate. A public space, neutral ground, a place where the rules of the apartment wouldn't apply. She wanted to recalibrate, to confront, to escalate. I could feel the electricity even before stepping out into the cool night air, the scent of wet asphalt and autumn leaves heavy in my lungs. The park was nearly empty, lit by scattered lampposts, casting long, distorted shadows. She was already there, leaning against a railing, coat pulled tight, hands stuffed into pockets. When I approached, she straightened, eyes flashing with a mix of irritation and something softer, more dangerous. "You're testing me," she said, voice low. "Do you even understand what that means?" "I understand perfectly," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "It's not about breaking you. It's about showing you what choice feels like when you're confronted with consequences." She tilted her head, gaze sharp, searching, assessing. "And what if I don't like the consequences?" "Then you'll make a choice," I said, "and live with it." We stood there for a long moment, rain beginning to drizzle again, the sound tapping out a rhythm that matched the rapid beating of my heart. In that quiet, soaked, dimly lit park, I realized that our little game had escalated beyond the apartment, beyond keys and drawers. We were entangled now, in a web of perception, power, and obsession neither of us could fully untangle. And as she finally turned and walked away, the faint smirk on her lips betraying her composure, I knew this was only the beginning. What had started as a boundary, a simple line drawn in sand, had become a labyrinth of tension, desire, and subtle cruelty. A labyrinth I wasn't sure either of us could escape from. The days after the park incident were different. The apartment felt alive, with unspoken anticipation, like the air itself had thickened with tension. Every step I took on the hardwood floors, every breath I drew, felt loaded with possibility and danger. I knew she was watching me, sensing my rhythms, testing me in ways that were almost imperceptible. The key incident had started the chain reaction, the park encounter had escalated, and now we were both caught in a current too strong to resist. She returned later that evening, coat damp, hair sticking faintly to her cheeks, and there was a storm behind her eyes. She didn't speak at first, only let the door click shut behind her, the sound echoing like a small verdict. I could feel her presence before I saw her, a force that pushed against the calm I was trying to maintain. "Sit," she said finally, voice low but commanding. Not a request, an order. I complied, perching on the edge of the couch as she paced the room, fingers brushing against books, photos, objects as if measuring the space, testing my reactions. Her eyes flicked to me occasionally, sharp, calculating, and I felt the familiar thrill of uncertainty. What would she do next? What had she planned? "You think this is a game," she said after a long pause. "That I'm just a piece on a board, waiting for you to make your moves. But what you don't understand," her voice softened slightly, almost dangerously, "is that every move I make is mine, not yours." "I know," I said quietly, keeping my tone steady, masking the pulse of excitement and fear that ran through me. "And yet, here we are, still moving." She stopped pacing, standing across from me, rain dripping from her coat onto the rug, leaving tiny dark circles that bloomed like ink. "Why do you do this?" she asked. "Why push boundaries that aren't yours to touch?" "Because boundaries teach us who we are when the rules vanish," I replied. "Because freedom is often only felt when it's denied first." Her lips pressed together, and for a heartbeat, the air between us was still, charged, vibrating with the weight of everything left unsaid. Then she laughed softly, a sound that was equal parts admiration and frustration. "You're infuriating," she said, almost a whisper. "And you love it," I replied, letting a faint smile tug at my lips. The game escalated slowly, like a simmering storm. Every night we tested the invisible rules of our connection, small adjustments to her space, subtle provocations, and the occasional deliberate omission. A mug out of place, a book spine facing the wrong way, a drawer slightly ajar. Each act was minor, almost imperceptible, but the effect was cumulative. She noticed everything, catalogued it in her mind, and responded with a mixture of irritation, curiosity, and quiet intrigue. One night, she came home to find the apartment rearranged. Not dramatically, just subtly. Sofa cushions shifted, the rug skewed slightly, the coffee table angled differently. She stopped at the threshold, her eyes scanning the room with a sharp precision I hadn't seen before. "You're obsessed?" she said finally, voice low, measured. "Obsessed with me, with control, with seeing how I react." "Maybe I am," I said, shrugging innocently, though inside a pulse of exhilaration raced through me. "Maybe I just want to understand. Maybe I want you to understand me too." She shook her head, a faint smirk playing on her lips, and moved past me into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, then leaned against the counter, eyes on me the whole time. "You're playing with fire," she said. "Do you even know what will happen when it catches?" "I think," I replied carefully. "I want to see it." Her lips pressed into a line, and she set the glass down with deliberate care. Then she walked to the living room, sat across from me, and crossed her arms. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of city traffic outside. The air was thick, almost electric, and I could feel her tension, matching mine, mirrored, synchronized. For the next week, the apartment became a theater of psychological warfare. Each day brought new tests, subtle manipulations, and careful observations. I noticed how she adjusted when I moved objects slightly out of place, how her gaze lingered on areas I had touched, how her steps faltered just slightly when navigating spaces I had reorganized. And yet, beneath it all, there was fascination, a glimmer of acknowledgement that she was intrigued by the way I claimed small victories without ever overtly taking control. Then came the first true escalation. It was a Thursday evening, and the sky had turned a bruised gray, the kind that hints at a storm but never quite delivers. She returned home, coat damp, hair plastered to her neck, and I could see immediately that something had shifted. There was a sharpness in her movements, a calculated precision I hadn't observed before. "I've been thinking," she said as she entered, voice steady but tinged with tension, "about boundaries, about choices, about control." I nodded slowly, watching her carefully, aware that this conversation could change everything. "And?" I prompted gently. "And I want to test you," she said, eyes glinting with a dangerous edge. "See how far you're willing to push. See if you're serious about all this freedom and consequence talk." I felt a jolt of anticipation. The game was no longer subtle. She was taking the initiative, turning the tables, and I realized in that moment that the chessboard had expanded. She was no longer just responding. She was creating, manipulating, and leading. Over the next few nights, she introduced small challenges, tasks, constraints, minor puzzles that required observation, patience, and ingenuity. Sometimes it was as simple as finding a misplaced object. Other times it was more intricate, deciphering the meaning behind a cryptic note or following subtle instructions she left in plain sight. Each challenge was a test, a lesson, a small shift in the balance of power between us, and I loved it. One night she left a note tucked under the edge of my pillow. "Be ready. Midnight. The old theater. The old theater." I knew the place. Abandoned for years, shuttered, the marquee half fallen, the posters yellowed and curling. It was the kind of place that held echoes, memories trapped in dust and shadows. I arrived early, the streets wet from rain, the air crisp and carrying the faint scent of asphalt and decay. The theater loomed ahead, dark and silent, a relic of forgotten glamour. I stepped inside, cautious, the wooden floors creaking under my weight. Dust motes floated in the beams of light that filtered through broken windows. The air smelled of mold and faded popcorn, a strange nostalgia that made my stomach tighten. She was there, standing on the stage, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through a hole in the roof. "You came," she said, voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "Of course," I replied, taking a slow step forward, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. She smiled faintly, then handed me a small folded card. "A challenge," she said simply. I opened it carefully. The message was cryptic. "Find the key, not the one you used before, the one that opens what's truly yours." I looked up at her, startled. "What does that mean?" "That," she said, voice soft but firm, "you'll have to discover, alone." The challenge was clear. The game had escalated beyond subtle manipulation in the apartment. Does it? Now it was public, deliberate, designed to push boundaries in ways I hadn't imagined. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with unease. This was no longer just about control or boundaries. This was about trust, perception, and risk. I spent the next hour exploring the theater, the wooden boards creaking underfoot, shadows stretching long and distorted across the walls. Every corner held potential secrets. Every flicker of moonlight seemed to suggest movement. I found nothing obvious at first, just old seats, torn curtains, and scattered debris. Then, in the farthest corner of the stage, partially hidden under a collapsed curtain, I found a small metal box, rusted and locked. The key she had spoken of wasn't in sight. I examined the box carefully, tracing the edges with my fingers. There was a faint inscription, nearly illegible. "Truth lies within." My pulse quickened. This was more than a game. This was a test of perception, patience, and perhaps something deeper: trust, surrender, understanding. I glanced toward her on the stage, watching, evaluating, a silent judge of my reactions. Hours passed as I searched the theater, piecing together subtle clues she had left behind. Marks on the floorboards, faint scratches along the walls, a misplaced chair that pointed toward a hidden compartment beneath the balcony. Each discovery brought me closer, the thrill of the hunt mingling with a growing sense of unease. Finally, I found a small, brass key hidden in the hollow of a broken beam. It was warm to the touch, as if carrying intention, as if waiting for me to act. I held it carefully, heart racing, and looked toward her. She nodded faintly, the corners of her lips lifting ever so slightly. "You found it," she said, voice soft, almost a whisper. "But now, the real choice begins." And in that moment, I realized that the not married game we had been playing was no longer about trivial power plays or subtle provocations. It was about surrender, understanding, and facing consequences neither of us had fully anticipated. The key in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It was a symbol, a challenge, and a question. And as I stepped closer to her on the stage, I knew that everything we had done up until now, the small manipulations, the subtle provocations, the tension, was just the prelude to something far more profound and unpredictable. Holding the brass key in my hand, I felt the weight of more than metal. It was a weight of anticipation, of possibility, of all the unspoken tensions that had been building over weeks. The theater around us seemed alive, every shadow twisting, every creaking floorboard echoing like a warning. She stood on the stage, watching me, and for a moment the entire world contracted into the space between us, heavy with unsaid things, untested fears, and mutual fascination. "This is it," she said softly, her voice carrying in the hollow theater, bouncing against broken walls and dusty rafters. "The choice you make now, it will define everything that comes after." I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse hammering in my temples. "Define everything how?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Her gaze didn't waver. "Define whether you're capable of seeing beyond the surface of control, whether you understand freedom or just think you do, whether you can accept consequences." I nodded slowly, aware of the gravity of the moment. The key in my hand wasn't just an object. It was a challenge, a test, a question. And I knew deep down that she had orchestrated this entire chain of events, the locked doors, the small manipulations, the cryptic notes, all to lead to this point. I began to explore the theater more deliberately, moving across the stage, checking the old curtain folds, the sides of the balcony, the dust-covered seating. Each step was measured, calculated, a mix of adrenaline and careful observation. My eyes scanned for hidden compartments, anomalies, anything that could correspond to the brass key. The air smelled of mildew and old varnish, of decay and history, carrying a faint thrill with every inhalation. She didn't move from the stage. She just watched, her expression unreadable, letting me take the lead. I realized then that this was a deliberate shift. She had ceded apparent control to me, but in truth, she had orchestrated every detail, every cue, every subtle marker I had noticed along the way. Every challenge had been planted to teach, provoke, and test simultaneously. Finally, under a collapsed row of theater seats, I found a small latch. Heart racing, I fit the brass key into the lock. The metal resisted at first, then clicked into place with a satisfying snap. I lifted the lid and found a folder, yellowed at the edges, tied with a faded ribbon. Inside were photographs, notes, and fragments of memories, scenes from our lives, moments I thought were private, some I didn't even remember sharing with her, moments she had observed, collected, and preserved. I froze. The depth of what she had done was staggering. This wasn't just a game of boundaries. It was an intricate exercise in observation, understanding, and emotional revelation. She had watched me, noted my patterns, my habits, my quirks, every minor detail that revealed my inner world, and now she had given it back to me in a way that was both intimate and unsettling. "You see now," she said from the stage, voice low and even, "what it means to have someone understand you completely, to see every corner of your habits, your decisions, your vulnerabilities, and yet to still remain unseen." I looked up at her, heart hammering, caught between admiration, fear, and something darker. "You've been following me this whole time?" "I've been watching you," she admitted. "Not in the way you think, not to control you, not to trap you, but to understand, to see how you react when rules shift, when boundaries are tested, when trust is challenged." The revelation hit me like a wave. Every subtle adjustment, every note, every key-related maneuver now took on a new weight. She hadn't been playing the same game as me. She had been conducting a symphony of tension, trust, and revelation. "You've been orchestrating all of this," I said, voice almost a whisper, the enormity of it sinking in. "Not orchestrating," she corrected gently. "Guiding, observing, teaching. You think control is about dominance, about rules and possession, but it's not. It's about understanding, about seeing the other person in full, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's messy." I stared down at the folder in my hands, flipping through photographs and notes. Each image, each scribbled observation, each memory fragment was a mirror of my own life, but one I hadn't recognized as being seen so clearly, so intentionally. The intimacy of it was overwhelming. I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely exhilarated. She stepped down from the stage, moving closer, the faint echo of her steps filling the theater like deliberate punctuation. "Do you understand now?" she asked softly, eyes locking with mine. "Do you understand what it means to see, to be seen, to navigate freedom and consequence at the same time?" I nodded, though the words felt insufficient. "I think I do." "Then comes the final part," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The part that defines everything." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The tension, the anticipation, the danger, all of it coalesced into a single moment. I realized that this wasn't just a psychological exercise. This wasn't just about observation or control. This was about trust, surrender, and facing consequences in a raw, unfiltered way. She moved closer, standing just a few feet away. Her expression softened, but her eyes remained intense, unwavering. "You can choose to walk away," she said. "You can leave this theater, leave the folder, leave me. But if you do, you'll never truly understand what we've been exploring. You'll never see the depth of what's possible when boundaries, control, and freedom collide." I swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every part of me was drawn to the intensity of this moment, the magnitude of what she was offering. I had come this far, navigated every subtle test, observed every carefully planted clue, and now the final decision lay before me. I stepped closer to the folder, fingers brushing over the photographs once more. Each image, each note, each fragment of memory whispered a truth about myself I hadn't fully confronted. And then I looked at her, really looked at her, the strength, the vulnerability, the intricate web of intention and emotion woven into every action she had taken. "I'm not leaving," I said finally, voice steady despite the chaos of emotion inside me. "I want to see it through, to understand, to face it all." She smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and something darker, more thrilling. "Good," she said softly, "because now the truth begins." And with that, she guided me to a corner of the theater I hadn't explored, where a small trapdoor led down into the bowels of the building. Dust and shadows clung to the walls as we descended, the air growing colder, heavier, thick with anticipation. The silence was almost tactile, pressing against my ears, filling every crevice of thought with tension. At the bottom she paused. A single bulb flickered, casting long, wavering shadows, and then she gestured to the final space, a small enclosed room. Walls lined with photographs, notes, and objects I recognized immediately. Items from our apartment, small things I had thought trivial, now curated and displayed like relics in a shrine. The key in my hand felt impossibly heavy, as though it were a bridge between ordinary life and this almost sacred, terrifying space she had created. "This," she said softly, voice reverent yet edged with challenge, "is the culmination. Every choice, every boundary, every act of trust or defiance, it all leads here. And now, you must decide what it means. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. The room, the photographs, the notes, it was all overwhelming. A tapestry of control, freedom, observation, and consequence. And yet, beneath it all, there was a lesson in intimacy, in understanding, in the terrifying and exhilarating act of seeing and being seen in full. "You've shown me everything," I said quietly, voice almost breaking. "Every rule, every test, every subtle manipulation. I understand now. I think I finally understand." She stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body. "Then you know," she said, eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room spin slightly, "that control isn't about possession. It's about awareness, choice, and trust. And if you can face this, truly face it, then you can move forward. But if you falter—" Her voice trailed, letting the weight of unspoken consequences hang in the air. The silence was unbearable, yet electric, charged with tension and possibility. I took a deep breath, gripping the brass key tightly, feeling the pulse of adrenaline, fear, and exhilaration all at once. "I won't falter," I said. "I'm ready to see it through, to face everything, to accept the consequences." She nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Then step forward," she said softly. "Step into the truth, and prepare yourself, because what you find may change everything you thought you knew about boundaries, freedom, and us." The room seemed to pulse with anticipation. Shadows flickered across the walls, the photographs staring back at me like silent witnesses. And as I stepped closer to the center of the room, I realized that this was no longer a game. It was a reckoning, a moment of truth, revelation, and emotional upheaval I could never have predicted when the key first refused to turn in the lock. And in that suspended moment, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. I stepped into the center of the room, the photographs and trinkets surrounding me like silent witnesses. The air was thick, humid, almost palpable, carrying the weight of every small provocation, every subtle test, every boundary we had pushed and transgressed. She watched me from the corner, the faint flicker of the bulb casting shadows across her face, highlighting the tension in her jaw, the intensity in her gaze. I lifted the brass key, turning it slowly in my hand as if it contained the sum of every choice I had made, every risk I had taken. The folder lay open on a pedestal in the center of the room, and I stepped closer, heart hammering, senses heightened. Every photograph, every note seemed to vibrate with meaning, telling a story not just of us, but of the fragile, terrifying, exhilarating nature of connection, control, and freedom. She approached, her movement deliberate, controlled, each step echoing softly against the concrete floor. "Do you see now?" she asked, voice low but clear. "Do you understand why I let you test me, why I orchestrated all of this?" I nodded, though words felt inadequate. "I see," I said finally. "I see everything. The tests, the keys, the small games, and the way they were all about trust, observation, and choice." Her smile was faint, almost enigmatic, and she reached out to touch my shoulder lightly, a gesture that carried both reassurance and challenge. "Exactly," she said. "And now, it's time to see the final consequence of your choices." I felt a chill run down my spine. The room seemed to tighten around us, the photographs and objects suddenly alive with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. She stepped back and gestured toward a small locked box on the pedestal beneath the folder. The brass key in my hand felt impossibly heavy, and I realized then that this box contained the ultimate truth, the revelation that would define everything between us. With a trembling hand, I inserted the key. The lock clicked, resisting briefly before yielding. I lifted the lid slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a single, folded letter, written in her handwriting. I unfolded it carefully, my eyes scanning the words. "You have seen, you have observed, you have followed. You have tested me, pushed boundaries, and navigated the tension I set before you. And now you know, freedom and control, choice and consequence are intertwined in ways most people never understand. But the truth is this: the moment you thought you held power, you were learning how to surrender. And surrender, when true, is the ultimate freedom." I felt my knees weaken, the weight of her words pressing against my chest. She had led me to this, not as punishment, not as a game, but as revelation. The entire arc, the key, The notes, the park, the theater, the hidden compartments, the photographs had been about teaching me to see, to trust, and to confront the consequences of my own curiosity and insistence. She stepped closer, her eyes softening, but still holding that dangerous edge. Do you understand what it means now? To be truly free, you must accept the full spectrum: intimacy, vulnerability, consequence, and trust. Not just selectively, not just when convenient, but wholly. I swallowed hard, nodding. I understand, I whispered, and I accept it. She smiled then, a full smile, one that held relief, admiration, and a hint of something I couldn't quite name. She took my hand gently, leading me out of the room, back into the dimly lit corridors of the theater. The outside world awaited, but everything had changed. The dynamic between us was no longer about control or subtle games. It was about mutual recognition of vulnerability, choice, and the delicate, terrifying balance between them. We stepped out into the night, the rain having stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the pale light of street lamps. Silence stretched between us, comfortable and charged. For the first time, I felt that our connection was unshakable, not because of dominance or testing, but because of the shared understanding of risk, surrender, and the courage to face consequences together. I realized then that the key had never been about locks. The notes had never been about manipulation. The challenges had never been about power. It was about revealing the truths that hide in plain sight, the truths about ourselves, our desires, our fears, and our capacity to trust. As we walked back toward the city, the air cool and fresh, I felt a profound clarity. Boundaries exist, not to restrict, but to teach. Control exists, not to dominate, but to illuminate. Freedom exists, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience, inseparable from consequence. And love, if it can be called that, exists in the space between seeing, understanding, and surrendering fully. She looked at me then, eyes reflecting the glimmering streetlights, and said softly, almost to herself, "We've learned something tonight, something that most people never do." I nodded, heart still racing, mind still grappling with the enormity of everything we had navigated together. "Yes," I said, "something rare, something real, something unforgettable." And in that moment I knew that the journey we had taken, through tension, challenge, provocation, and revelation, had changed us both irrevocably. The apartment, the key, the theater, the notes, they were all artifacts of a lesson we had learned together. And the lesson was not about winning or losing, not about control or dominance, but about trust, choice, vulnerability, and the terrifying, beautiful freedom of surrender. As the night stretched on, I felt the quiet hum of understanding settle into my bones. There was no grand finale, no dramatic flourish, only the slow, steady realization that we had both changed, that the games had ended, but the insight had only just begun. And as we disappeared into the night, side by side, I carried with me a profound respect for the complexity of boundaries, the intensity of consequence, and the intoxicating, unpredictable beauty of truly seeing and being seen. As the story closes, take a moment to consider the delicate dance of boundaries, trust, and control in your own life. How do you respond when someone challenges the limits you thought were fixed? When do you assert control, and when do you allow yourself to surrender, even if it feels vulnerable or uncomfortable? How do you navigate the tension between freedom and consequence, curiosity and respect, desire and restraint? Could the games we play in our relationships reveal more about our own capacity for understanding, empathy, and intimacy than we realize? And finally, what would it truly mean to be fully seen and to see someone else completely without reservation?